And now for a conversation about the recent assaults on human knowledge and progress, please welcome Atlantic journalists Megan Garber, Franklin Foer, and Adam Serwer. Here to lead the discussion is Atlantic staff writer Helen Lewis.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm lucky to have three of the Atlantic's most knowledgeable journalists in this one. I'm going to start off with Adam, because it was really, I guess, your piece about what you, in the copy, called the new dark ages that kind of kicked off the idea for this panel. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I was trying to describe was an attack on basically all forms of knowledge production, whether that's, BLS statistics, whether that's scientific research institutions, whether that's universities, whether it's the government's own internal watchdogs, whether it's museums. Now they're trying to take away mentions of slavery from Harper's Ferry, which, if you know anything about Harper's Ferry, it sort of defeats the entire purpose of the thing. The idea behind this is you want to destroy all forms of authority that could be used to produce knowledge that might lead people to oppose Donald Trump. They want a population that is entirely ignorant except about the greatness of the leader. And that is going to have severe consequences for scientific progress, because virtually every major technological advancement that we take for granted, initially began as a form of government-sponsored research precisely because it was before those technologies were commercially profitable. And we're just not going to know things about our world and how it works because Trump regards those, or the people who work for Trump regard those things as a threat to his power. And the only place that leads is to, a halt, or at least a slowing of technological and human progress. And that's something that I think is completely self-inflicted and unnecessary.
Was there a particular example that really stunned you, that was what led you to write that piece?
No, I think it was really collectively the whole thing. I mean, as Frank Foer wrote in his piece about how Trumpism had discovered the class enemy, educational polarization means that you have all these college-educated people who have moved left, and this is a way to destroy their ability to have a livelihood. But it's so sweeping. Whether you're in the medical profession, whether you're in the science profession, whether you're a mathematician or someone who works with economic knowledge. I mean, the breadth of it is so wide to just completely destroy what fundamentally is probably the most efficient system for accumulating and categorizing and presenting human knowledge that has ever existed. To want to destroy that simply because somebody might come up with something that makes Trump look bad, I think is really horrifying. And so I just felt like I had to talk about it as a totalizing thing because it wasn't just happening in one area.
Right. Well, let me bring in Frank at this point, because you wrote a book called World Without Mind, which looked at a kind of tech version of this, right? This isn't just a political story. This is a technological story, and I think there's been a lot of discussion really about how we kind of have maybe got to the Wall-E future, right, where actually people are just feel very passive, they're consuming things very passively. The active pursuit of knowledge has not been encouraged by any of the tech platforms that we use every day.
I'm going to answer that, but I just want to piggyback on what Adam said just a bit first, which is that when Leonard Leo, who he received, I think, the largest, he was the guy who was the head of the Federal Society that remade the judiciary, got one of the biggest gifts in the history of philanthropy. And he just said he was going to use it to take over the culture in the way that he took over the courts. And he's not especially prominent in this administration, but when I think about what's happening now as it relates to the constellation of institutions and that system that Adam described, I think about Project 2025, which mapped out the plumbing of the government and said, like, if we're going to achieve power in government, this is how it's going to work. But I think,
so for anybody who hasn't read our colleague David Graham's brilliant book, this is the Heritage Foundation's kind of, again, to use your word, Adam, totalizing plan for government, right? Here are all the ways we can go in and have a very short march through the institutions.
Exactly. But adjacent to that is like the plan for remaking government was a plan for remaking culture and the production of knowledge. And it was done in the spirit of taking over the courts, which is that it viewed the institutions as instruments of power, and it viewed the takeover of these institutions as being necessary to achieving power. So you see the way in which the FCC is now throwing around its weight in order to achieve the administration's ends as it relates to television. You see the way that that they've done this with the universities, which was hatched because the federal government is so deeply entangled in every aspect of American life. When it exists when it's constrained, that power is constrained by norms and a pursuit of, knowledge is an important word because it implies something objective, not a will for power. And I've just totally not answered your question.
I only started smiling when you were talking because one of the great tweets of our time was from Vice President J.D. Vance today when he said, "I don't think Jimmy Kimmel is funny." And I thought, I don't know what you think is funny. Like, what is that cat? Like, he's not my top choice for the next, New York Times comedy critic. Put it that way. But tell me a bit more about the tech part of it.
Well, so I think one of the gravest dangers is that that you have big tech, which has churned through the rest of the media industry. That big tech has managed to concentrate power at the expense of a more pluralistic information environment. And of course, big tech presents as something that is pluralistic because, hey, everybody who posts to Instagram or to the platform formerly known as Twitter has their own opinion. They're able to generate something that seems like it's authoritative and informative, and yet that's come at the expense not only of the traditional gatekeepers, who it turned out at least who had lots of problems, we can acknowledge that, but who did a better job than it turns out this kind of manipulated system does for generating information. And then there's there's just the kind of the underlying incentive structure of these platforms, which exist to generate outrage, which exist to generate addiction, and have played this role in addicting us to kind of these emotional states, which actually are anathema to analysis and knowledge, because it privileges the subjective experience. It privileges the individual opinion above, whatever the underlying objective reality is.
Well, Megan, let me ask you a very unfair question, which is essentially, why does everybody hate intellectuals? But you know what I mean? This is to some extent new, but there are words we have like smarty pants or know-it-all that imply that somebody who's got knowledge and is showing off about it, that is to something that maybe makes other people feel uncomfortable. Is this a particularly anti-intellectual period we're living through?
I think it definitely is. It's funny you asked that question because I was thinking of the book Anti-Intellectualism in American Life from the mid-20th century, and the historian Richard Hofstadter talking about kind of the origins of anti-intellectualism in America. And I think that term has become so standard now, but I think one of the things that he really identified was that knowledge and the performance of knowledge are matters of identity in a way that feels so rich to this moment. Just like you were saying, Frank, where it's subjective. Knowledge becomes something that we can choose. And something I'm especially worried about is what happens when knowledge itself, to both of your points, becomes fully a consumer good, not something that exists outside of us, not something that has an objective reality, a communal reality, but something that we can just sort of pick and choose as it fits our identity and our preferred conception of ourselves and our preferred conception of the world. And I do think that's what's happening, is we're getting this kind of market logic taking over what knowledge even means. And so, instead of, if it's true, that it doesn't matter whether we like it or not, we're sort of losing that paradigm, I think. And now it's much more, it's true if I want it to be.
Right.
Does it make me feel good to know it?
Who's that?
Does it make me feel good to know it?
Exactly.
And if it does, it's true. And if it doesn't, it's not.
Exactly. And does it serve my worldview, et cetera? And does it serve my team? All of that. Yeah.
But there is some interesting research, isn't there, that, for example, on who do I trust on, say, COVID? And that's very polarized by party. But actually, both sets of people say they trust their family doctor. So there are some types of knowledge that people still do acknowledge that some people might be had to specialize. But Adam, is that retreating as everything becomes more and more politicized, do you think?
Well, I think the difference between your family doctor and a doctor on Instagram, for example, is that the doctor knows you, right? So this is a person who, is sort of invested in your, in your well-being. And I think you would probably find similar results for people who maybe don't like teachers or teachers unions in general probably really like their own kid's teacher or something like that. And I think, this is related to something people instinctively understand about social media, which is that it's there, it's not there to give you information that's true. It's there to keep you looking. And I think that's that's really the distinction between social media as a source for news and the news outlets themselves. Even the worst, most irresponsible news outlets are on some level trying to inform their readers. But and this is an example I use because it's completely apolitical, but I really love videos of big cats like tigers acting like house cats. And something that I've noticed is that the algorithm has started to produce AI videos that are not real. Because
can you imagine Adam's disappointment?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a tiger cuddling a lion, and it's not real, and I wish it was. But the point that I'm making here is that the platforms have no interest in whether the slop that they're feeding you is accurate in a way that is, for all the flaws of the original traditional media, is just not true. They want to keep you on your phone. They don't care if the thing is true. They don't care what effect it has on you as long as you keep scrolling. And I think that's, part of the issue here is, and I think people to some extent extensively understand that, which is why they might trust the family doctor, but they won't trust, someone far off who, who doesn't necessarily know them or care about them personally.
I guess my next question is whether or not you think that we're beginning to feel the consequences of this yet. Because when I was reading your piece, I was thinking about Lysenkoism, which was a Soviet vogue it was an alternate theory to Darwinism about ways you could grow crops. Eventually led to absolutely devastating crop failures and famines. And that was the point at which the Stalinist regime that thought it presumed to dictate what was true and what wasn't, it was faced by the actual reality of people not being able to eat. And have you seen consequential actions from some of this? I mean, the one that occurs to me perhaps is Elon Musk's failure at Doge, right? Where the great experiment of can I get 12 teenagers to remake the federal government did collapse pretty horribly. But are there other examples of that?
I think if the country tumbles into a serious recession of some kind, that, as a result of, say, the Bureau of Labor Statistics no longer being able to produce actual knowledge because Trump gets mad if the numbers aren't the way that he wants them to be. I think that kind of thing could actually have that effect, and I'm not rooting for that at all because it would be horrible. But, I think what you're describing, this reaction to Lysenkoism, there needed to be a catastrophe first for people to realize how bad it was.
Frank, I want to ask you about universities, which we mentioned here. How well are they dealing with this assault on knowledge, an assault on the idea of a university, right? The idea that it is now just a kind of snooty, elite, woke place that, blue-haired students hang around with and learning about women's studies. The idea that the attack on that just as a concept has been quite broad, I would say.
I would say badly.
Right, okay.
That universities that suffer from a couple problems. One, I think, is that there is a serious leadership deficit within American higher education, that the nature of the type of individuals who rise to the top of those institutions tend to be people who are rewarded for never roiling the waters. They're people who tend to be innately cautious, and that's come at the expense of their institutions, because it's meant that when their institutions do have versions of the problems that have been caricatures and used as pretext to destroy them, they've failed to act preemptively to address them. But it also means that they're not people who tend to have large public profiles and who make the case for American higher education. And so as the university is turned into a punching bag, they've been unable to defend themselves.
Well, tell us a little bit more about Harvard, because you wrote about that specific example.
Well, I think Harvard actually, there are a couple of very interesting things about Harvard. One is that it's very easy to look at one of these institutions from the outside and to say that they're totally clueless. And I described leadership that was clueless, but when you actually survey professors within the institution, they're like across the political spectrum, they're acutely aware of their own problems. At Harvard, when Harvard professors have been surveyed, they understand that there is insufficient political pluralism within the institution, and that has a real cost for classroom discussion, that they find that students tend to tell professors what they expect professors want to hear, which is not really the case. But then the other thing that's been interesting about Harvard is, of course, that they've, where other institutions of higher education have basically folded in the face of Trump's assault, Harvard has mounted some pretty significant resistance to it. And of course, they have the financial wherewithal to be able to do that. But I think when you scan the horizon of American society, there aren't too many other examples like Harvard. And they seem to at least have picked, they've picked a red line that I think makes a lot of sense to me, which is that they don't want a federal presence dictating their curriculum, and they don't want a federal monitor, which is something that Columbia, for whatever reason, agreed to. And I think I'm glad that they've fought so hard on that point, because that is the essential thing to defend.
And Megan, while we're doing this audit, let's maybe look at the traditional news media as well. Have they reacted well to the challenge from the influencers, the platforms?
Ooh, yes and no. I would say it's very hard to even know what the right reaction, I would say, would be. It's quite challenging. I do think, it's very hard to know that. I think that the term content is something that I think a lot about. And I think the fact that the existence of that term as it is, and the fact that we as journalists see ourselves as purveyors of content is a bit of a supplication, and a little bit of a, we've become a little bit complacent, I think, to just, to the social web in a certain way, because content, it doesn't matter if it's true or false, right? It exists to exist. It exists to be there, to feed the beast, to be in the churn of things. And I wish that, it's hard to know how much the media can do ourselves versus how much of this is sort of a broader responsibility. But I do wish that content, the term, kind of didn't exist, really. Or,
you don't like to think of yourself as a content creator, then? Content
creator. And so when you get your information from an influencer, to Adam's point, it doesn't matter fundamentally if it's true or false, as a good being sold. What matters is it entertaining? Is it compelling? Does it make me feel good? Is it something I want to buy? And that's something journalists have always wrestled with.
I had that exact thought. I was writing a piece this week about the kind of Charlie Kirk-aligned podcasters. I was thinking, what do I actually call these people? There is now a whole class of people, and you might call them MAGA influencers, you might call them podcasters, you might call them content creators. You might call them propagandists. They have all these different roles. That is a kind of a new. They look like journalists in some respects, but they're not abiding by the ethics of traditional American journalism. But that is a completely new type of knowledge production, I feel, that we've had in the last couple of years.
Influencer is such an interesting word, though, because it implies manipulation, right? In a way that's different than persuasion.
Adam.
No, I was going to say, to go back to your family doctor analogy, the parasocial relationships that some people have with these influencers, that creates an illusion of this person cares about me, I know this person, that kind of thing, which leads people to trust them. That's how the influencer thing works, is this sort of false creation of intimacy between you and the influencer that short circuits that sort of instinct of self-preservation that exists in other contexts. And so you trust this person even though they're wrong, even though their role is actually not to inform you, but to keep you watching them so that they can monetize your attention.
Yeah, or sell you something. I wanted to go back to what you were saying about museums, because I think that to me is one of the most striking examples of this destruction of knowledge. And tell me if you disagree with the thesis that I think there was a feeling that lots of American museums had become a kind of a downer, right? That was the essential criticism of them. They weren't telling a patriotic story, an uplifting story about America. And that's why, for example, the exhibits on slavery have been so heavily criticized.
I think the question of whether they were telling an uplifting story is really in the eye of the beholder, right? Because I think, full disclosure, my mother worked at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, aka the Blacksonian. And when I went through that museum, I do not feel like it's not patriotic. It tells an extraordinary story of perseverance and commitment to American values and ideals. But it makes some it made some Trumpist white people feel bad, so they want to censor it. And they want to censor it at George Washington's home, and they want to censor it at Thomas Jefferson's home, and they want to censor it at Harper's Ferry because they don't want to confront the reality of American history, and that includes the ugly things. And to me, that is not patriotism. To replace the actual story of America with a kind of jingoistic propaganda, that says to me that you don't actually love your country as it is. You love a version of your country that makes you feel good in a particular way, but you don't actually love America as it is. And I think that's as true of museums as it is of, the people who think America was better when it was a completely different country, 50, 60 years ago. Well, that means to a certain extent, what you're loyal to is an idea of yourself, not an idea of the country.
I did not know your mum worked at that museum. It's a great museum, the Smithsonian.
Thank you. Well, she's retired now, but
okay, she can't take entire credit for it.
Before I talked about how awesome the museum was, I didn't want to have anybody accuse me of being secretly biased.
Okay,
yes,
you're openly biased, and
but
that's fine. Megan, I want to ask you a difficult question, which is, I think in light of all this, it can be very easy to become blind to the mistakes that maybe elite institutions have made. What do you think those are? Have there been times in which you might say the left or the Democrats or the elite institutions of power have opened up spaces to be attacked that they didn't need to do?
I think definitely, and actually the media too, in certain ways. I mean, I actually started out in journalism as a media critic, and so it was my job to sort of, document the oversteps and the errors that the media had made, and there are many, because we're human, of course. So yes, there are many things you could point to in terms of exposure and making ourselves sort of vulnerable to these ideas. But I would say it's very hard because I don't quite know what the alternative would be. I'm not quite sure how people could have done differently given...
Do you know the thing that really strikes me is that is the polarization of the American media. I remember in our boss Jeff's interview with Barack Obama, he talked about maybe during his first campaign, he used to go to a little town and there'd be a guy who ran a local newspaper and he'd have a bow tie on and he'd be a Republican, but he'd also give him a fair hearing. Yep. And then those places got bought out. They got overtaken by very partisan talk radio stations. And so you ended up with this big gulf in American media, which is very different to media in Britain, anywhere else in Europe, where there's just no kind of the hollow middle.
Yep.
And from my perspective as a British person, if you go on the BBC, which is funded by taxpayer licensing, if you do a political program, they have to have all sides represented, right? And so you have a political culture in which people are constantly brought into contact with people who don't agree with them. And I think the siloing of American media has been, I can understand why it's happened. It's really uncomfortable to share spaces with people who think very differently to you. But I think in the end that has perhaps contributed to some of the crisis of legitimacy. I
think that's absolutely right. I do. And I think also, I think we have this kind of blanket cynicism happening right now where, there is a mistrust of journalists in general, a mistrust of institutions, mistrust of elites, however you want to define that. One thing that contributes to it is simply that I think we've for so long conflated intelligence and knowledge, which are fundamentally different things, right? But I think just in our language and our conversations and discourse, we've allowed those things to be conflated. So if you profess knowledge about something, it sounds like you are professing, I am smart, when in fact, no, you just happen to know something. And then on the flip side, you know, if you are curious about something, that would imply ignorance,
right.
You know? And so I think just that fact of the conflation is already a problem. But then to your point, we have that combined with, I mean, the media is both so big and so small.
Oh yeah, and who knows what anyone means by the media. Well, look, I wanted to also ask you guys about RFK Jr., but people are going to have to go and read. We do a lot of great coverage of that on the Atlantic website, because I want to wrap up by asking you all to end us on a slightly hopeful note. Is there anybody you can think of who's resisting this attack and assault on knowledge?
Yes.
Don't all rush at once.
I think the extraordinary thing is that, you know, as Frank alluded to, you have an entire class of American elites who were selected, you know, to hold positions of power and influence, who have, you know, one by one kneeled and folded immediately in the face of, you know, not even relentless assault, but at the first sign of difficulty. And then you have people who, you know, have been thrown in a dark ice cell, you know, because they went to a pro-Palestinian protest, and those people have come out and said, oh, no, I believe what I believe, and I'm not going to be silenced. And I think the problem right now is that you have a lot of Americans who are very brave, who are not going to shut up, who are not going to be silenced, who are not going to be forced into paying fealty to a leader or to ideas that they do not support. But those people are not the ones with power, and that's the real problem.
Frank, you look like you were about to offer a note of hope.
Well, I was going to go in a little bit of a different direction, which is just that, you know, there's so much about, we've talked about technology some, and there's so much that about the narrative that we tell ourselves about technology that seems deterministic, that these things are inevitable. And I think of some things that seemed like they were inevitable, but that haven't really turned out that way. So
are you talking about the metaverse?
I'm talking about the metaverse. No, I'm talking about, I mean, that is one good example. I think another good example is that when the ebook was introduced, everybody said that the hardcover, you know, words between pages, between covers was going to disappear. And like, lo and behold, the paper book continues to exist. It continues to be kind of a sanctuary from the assault on attention that we described. I think when you look at the web, there was a lot about the web that seemed like it was going to be forever headed in a direction where it would be commoditized. But you see, this is not just a plea to subscribe to the Atlantic, but you see the way in which that economy has shifted so that you do have a return to subscriptions, which is an elitist way of providing, but it's also a reversal of the kind of the clickbait economy that we saw.
Put your money in things that you care about, and put your knowledge into forms that are hard to destroy. Well, that seems like a very good moment for us to end on. So please give all my panelists a big round of applause.